Now, the idea of Gaelic being spoken in these two regions of North America might be somewhat surprising to some of you, but I'll hopefully unpack that as we go along. I'm going to try and take you today on a sort of broad sweep of my research activity over the last 7 or 8 years. See how successful I am in realising that fairly hopeful objective, and I'm hopefully to demonstrating the sort of common strand in my research over this period as well, and we'll see whether I manage to do that convincingly or not. So I'll talk firstly through some of the results of my British Academy postdoc, which I held at the University of Edinburgh, before speaking a little bit about key findings, conclusions from my 2019 book, and then talking in a bit more detail about the research context of Nova Scotia and New England, this latter project being based on a Fulbright I conducted in Boston last year. So I'll take you through these things stage by stage, hopefully. So yeah, I was working in Nova Scotia for a few years. For those of you whose Latin is as rusty as mine, it's helpful to have, this was on Halifax Boardwalk in Nova Scotia. Helpfully explains for us, Nova Scotia is Latin for New Scotland. So we have New Scotland and we have New England in the mix, as well as Old Scotland today. So I'll describe some of the different conclusions and research objectives of the different projects I've been involved in. So my 2019 book looked at sort of long-term outcomes of Gaelic medium immersion education in Scotland. And then building on this, my postdoctoral fellowship, because although it was published in 2019, the book was based on my doctoral thesis, which I completed in 2015. And the postdoc funded by the British Academy investigated the role of what we call new speakers of Gaelic in both Scotland and Nova Scotia, examining the relationship of new speakers' Gaelic language use, their language ideologies and identities. And this is currently in the process of being completed. I have a full working manuscript now. I hope to submit it by the end of the month. We'll see. Might appear in press by the end of the year, but I expect it will be next year. And again, New Scotland popping up here. So the postdoc analysis drew on results from an online survey of language practices, language learning experiences and attitudes, which received a fairly modest sample, only 80 responses, but also this more detailed qualitative analysis drawing on 60 semi-structured interviews with 30 speakers in Canada, 30 in Scotland, as well as participation in Gaelic communities in both research contexts. The bit of disparity here, I've been involved in the Gaelic community in Scotland for in relation to new speakers now for 12 years. We'll compare that with the 12 weeks I was in Nova Scotia. But still, I think hopefully the 3 months I was in Nova Scotia generated some useful insights. More recently, as I say, my 3-month Fulbright at Harvard examined this sort of secondary migrant experience of speakers and learners of Scottish Gaelic in New England. There's quite a long-standing connection between Nova Scotia and New England, which I'll go into a bit later today. And this research is really just sort of tagged on to the Nova Scotia research in a sense, composed of 12 interviews, 6 of which were conducted in Gaelic, 4 over Zoom. There were 7 females, and the age is quite a broad sweep of ages. The youngest was a 4-year-old who had been studying some Gaelic in immersion settings in Nova Scotia, and between living in Boston and studying a little bit there, so she was able to speak some Gaelic to me, the oldest being 58. To talk you briefly through the findings of my thesis and my 2019 book, this study drew on interviews with 46 adults who'd gone through GME, Gaelic medium education, in the first decade of its availability. Now, Gaelic medium education started in 1985, so as with most things, we're about 30 years behind you guys when it comes to language development, language planning, policy. There was also an online survey which received 112 questionnaire responses over the months in which it was open. And the 130 participants in total, using these 2 combined methodologies, approximated to about 10% of all adults who'd been through Gaelic medium in the first decade. So it started off very, very small. There are 24 kids who started in 1985. These days, the policymakers claim there are around about 6,000 children in Gaelic medium education in Scotland. So it's grown fast, not as fast as perhaps we would like. And the results of this study were really, most important conclusions were the widely varying competences and levels of Gaelic oracy, of speaking ability among these cohorts. There were key statistical correlations between higher levels of linguistic ability and use, you might understand that, between socialization in the language in childhood beyond just the Gaelic medium classroom and continued usage, and between continuity in Gaelic medium continuing through Gaelic medium study into secondary school and continued higher levels of usage. But generally, most participants in the study claimed relatively limited day-to-day use of Gaelic in their present lives. And notably, the possession of a sort of a distinctive identity as a Gaelic speaker, or particularly as a Gael, was rejected by very many, or at least downplayed by the majority. A bit of context here. So in terms of the decline of Gaelic, it's been pretty rapid, really, perhaps less rapid than we've seen in certain geographies in Wales, but you see here sort of the end game, really, of Gaelic language decline. At an earlier stage, about 1,000 years ago, almost all of the map here would have been red, with exceptions in the far southeast and Orkney and Shetland to the north. But from around about the middle of the 14th century, the sort of the Highland line, the distinction here, you see here between sort of the dull, the boring, grey-coloured bit of Scotland and the more colourful bit. There's a fairly stable linguistic boundary from the 14th century all the way up until the 17th and 18th centuries. Gaelic was spoken really by the vast majority of people to the north and west of this line, varieties of Scots and English being spoken to the south and east. But we see the line retreating very suddenly from the end of the 19th century. Partly as a sort of delayed consequence of the Highland clearances, and we'll unpack this in future slides and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. And then we see this real rapid shift to English over broad sweeps of the Highlands and Islands until we get up to the 2001 census, and we'll have a look, zoom in actually on the results of the 2011 census here, and we see the concentrations have retreated even further to the north and west, particularly these heartland communities of the Western Isles, but there's only now a bare majority of people who reported in that census return that they were able to speak Gaelic. It's likely that it might fall below 50%, and it was the 2022 census in Scotland. We were years delayed, behind by a year, collecting data for that. What the map doesn't show is, so it shows the concentrations quite clearly, but doesn't show the fact that there are almost equal proportions of Gaelic speakers now in the more densely shaded areas like Highlands and Islands, and the more lighter coloured areas of the lowlands. The proportions are more or less equal now, and indeed the 2022 results might show that there's a majority of Scotland's Gaelic speakers living in the urban lowlands as opposed to the Highlands and Islands. There's also questions about the validity of the 2022 census. There was less than 70% completion in some areas, so we don't. the usual caveats that apply to census data will apply even more so to the census results, I'm sure, when they're eventually published in Scotland. There are also these 1.4 million active Duolingo users internationally. Since that, the Gaelic version of the app launched in 2021, it's just exploded in terms of the number of people that have taken interest. And this is sort of 3 times the numbers of Gaelic speakers who have ever existed at any one time. You know, when Gaelic speakers accounted for 50% of the population in Scotland, the total population in Scotland wasn't much more than 600,000. So we're talking about a massive increase in those who are engaging with the language at all. In terms of how many of these 1.4 million people are actually progressing to using and speaking the language, well, we really have no idea, but it's not going to be very large numbers. In terms of public policy for the generation of new speakers, particularly by the expansion of Gaelic medium education in Scotland. This has been a common refrain in language policy documents over the last 20 years or so. You see here in a couple of extracts, one from the last iteration of the National Gaelic Language Plan, which is produced by Bord na Gaelic every 5 years. So Bord na Gaelic is the statutory agency charged with revitalising Gaelic in Scotland under the 2005 Act, which we based really quite closely on the 1993 Welsh Act, Welsh Language Act, but we are quite behind in some of our strategies. So Bord na Gaelic is essentially corresponds to the old Bord na Iaith back when that had a statutory role. So the movement to a commissioner is something that we talk about occasionally in Scotland. I don't know if we're going to get there anytime soon, but we're quite behind. Nevertheless, so we see here in the last national plan, Bord na Gaelic said, "Our clear view is that Gaelic education makes an important contribution to the aim of increasing numbers of those speaking, using and learning the language." Not just those learning language, but actually speaking, using language in communities. This is the aspiration. The Scottish National Party, in their 2021 manifesto, actually made some quite specific commitments to Gaelic, and particularly to growing Gaelic medium education. They said, "We remain committed to ensuring Gaelic has a sustainable long-term future. We'll have a focus on arresting and intensifying language shift in the remaining vernacular communities." And this particular phrase has a certain pedigree. We can explore that a bit later, perhaps. They wrote, "Gaelic medium education is a key driver for ensuring that Gaelic continues to thrive and grow in both urban and rural areas." And as I say, we can I'll maybe explain a bit more about the specific commitments they made to Gaelic. Quite unusually for a party like the Scottish National Party, which unlike Cymru has never really taken a very significant interest in the Gaelic language or linguistic issues generally in their view of national identity. I was part of this as certain other people in the room were, Cost Action for the last few years in which it was operating. Previous work on new speakers generally has explored the phenomenon. It's, as many of you in the room will know, often defined as being made up of individuals who have acquired an additional language outside of the home, often as part of formal education, and continue to make frequent use of it over the course of their daily lives. So common research themes across the network and subsequent work that was produced off the back of the Cost Action has addressed issues of authenticity, linguistic identities and trajectories, notions of legitimacy and speaking minority languages in particular. The relevance really in my own research was the importance that policymakers place on the generation of new speakers, and whether in Scotland or Canada, there's frequent reference made in policy documents to the role that new speakers will play in ensuring that the Gaelic language continues to be spoken both in Scotland and Nova Scotia. In terms of theoretical frameworks, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but in addition to the new speakers phenomenon, I look in detail at issues of language ideologies, particularly iconization, indexicality, most frequently originating in the work of linguistic anthropologists based in the US, many of whom we see cited here. Also issues of integrativeness and the motivational self-system developed by Zoltan Dernier and Emo Shioda in terms of the ideal and ought to L2 self. And also developing on this a notion introduced by Peter McIntyre and colleagues based on the Nova Scotia experience of the rooted L2 self. So it's not just a question of an L2 learner wanting to integrate with an L1 community, to integrate with something which is other, but it's a case of, at least in the Nova Scotia context, individuals acquiring or relearning the language, which is a heritage language for their families. This notion, thus, of a rooted L2 self being described as sort of qualitatively distinct from that of just an integrating with an L2 community as such. Some work that colleagues and I conducted on the phenomenon of new Gaelic speakers in Scotland found generally that the term Gaelic community, or in the language Coirsnach na Gaelic, was seen as preferable among new speakers of the language to the ethnonym sort of label Gaels or Gael in the language. New speakers in our research reported different linguistic behaviours. Generally, native speakers were regarded as the best model for the production of a blast, their accents, their feel for the language. But in other senses, native speakers' greater use of loan words from English was seen as something which was best avoided by new speakers. And in terms of the actual linguistic productions of new speakers, work that Claire Nance led on demonstrated that certain of our interviewees produced the language really quite startlingly differently from L1 speakers, particularly in relation to word final rhotics. And in terms of accent aim, there were some quite enlightening extracts included in Claire's analyses. So, for instance, the one speaker who had the pseudonym Polly asked, why would I have a North US accent, for example? I've never been there. So the idea of aiming for an L1 accent with which one has no connection was questioned by some of our informants. Moving on, Gaelic and Nova Scotia. So this is broadly where Nova Scotia is, for those of you familiar with that particular geography in the eastern seaboard there. So around about 500 miles north and west of Boston, a little bit further to Chicago, Toronto, and so on. The principal areas of Gaelic settlement in Nova Scotia from the end of the 18th century until the middle of the 19th century focus on these areas here. So this is Pictou and Antigonish counties on the mainland, and throughout Cape Breton Island at the eastern tip of the province. Scotland being sort of 2,500 miles back across the Atlantic this way. New England and the state of Maine being actually only sort of 50 or 60 miles across the water there, which has important implications for what I'll talk about a wee bit later. In terms of why Gaelic is spoken in Nova Scotia and subsequently potentially in New England, I mentioned there the areas of principal settlement in Nova Scotia. And this started really with mass migration from the Highlands to the eastern districts of Nova Scotia, starting in the 1770s and really accelerating through the early part of the 19th century towards the 1840s. Towards the end of this period, most of the migration stemming from mass clearances that were happening at this stage. Most of you will be familiar with the phrase the Highland clearances, but essentially this was the time when the Gaelic aristocracy, the landowners, decided that the people living on their estates and living on their land needed to go. And they would be replaced by sheep, who could be essentially a mechanical process for turning grass into meat that could be sold at market, whereas people subsisting, eking out a living on the land was not profitable at all, so they had to go. Initially, some of the sort of middle-class tacksman class were encouraged and even paid to get on boats to go to Nova Scotia or to New Zealand, different parts of the world. Towards the end of this period, people were just made homeless, in some cases burned out of their homesteads, and moved to settlements on the coast to farm kelp, or just encouraged to go to the cities, to Edinburgh, as happened with some of my ancestors, or to Glasgow, or even further afield than that, as we say. So many of them ended up making this journey. And what we see at this time, towards the middle of the 19th century, is these patterns of chain migration. So essentially the recreation or transplantation of communities, almost complete in their entirety, from areas, particularly in the Western Highlands, to these areas in eastern Nova Scotia. And the precise numbers of those who actually made the trip across the ocean are somewhat unclear. It seems that at least 25,000 people made this journey, which at the time was quite a dangerous voyage across. It took quite a long journey. Not everyone survived it across the Atlantic. By the 1890s, there were around about 80,000 Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia. So initially, these Gaelic-speaking communities really flourished. The identity, the culture, the language was passed on these generations. The population, as we see, grew, and the ethno-linguistic aspects of culture and identity were maintained along with the language. But towards the end of the 19th century, we see decline really setting in, without any institutional support for the language, just as was the case for Gaelic communities back in Scotland. increasing contact with an English dominant majority, and the increased economic vulnerability of these areas, particularly in eastern Nova Scotia, due to the change in the economy locally. And this caused mass out-migration from these areas that were settled by Gaelic speakers in eastern Nova Scotia, secondary out-migration to parts of Ontario, to Quebec, and also particularly to what they called at the time and continue to call the Boston State, New England, the city of Boston, and many of the other 6 states which make up New England. Professor Ken Nilsson, who worked for a long time in colleges, universities in New England, estimated in the 80s that there were around about 300 first language Gaelic speakers in the greater Boston area. I mean, Ken basically knew most of these people to speak to. And so part of my idea for the Fulbright that I conducted last year was to find out what became of these speakers, what happened to this 300 or so people who were still in Boston when I was born, in the 80s. And I'll get on to that in a moment. In terms of staying with Nova Scotia for now, the 1901 Canadian census recorded 50,000 Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia, so still over 10% of the provincial population. By 1931, this had fallen to around 24,000, and it's the 30s that have been identified as a real linguistic tipping point for Gaelic communities in Nova Scotia. So Elizabeth Mertz identified the metapragmatic filter, in her words, the folk ideas around language, maintenance, linguistic ideology, you might say, which dominated in Gaelic communities at this time. So it's particularly, as I say, the vulnerability of these communities during the time of the Great Depression led to essentially every subsequent census return showed a sort of 50% reduction in the number of Gaelic speakers recorded in Nova Scotia, until we get to 2001, where there were 542 recorded. 2011, 1,275 speakers of Gaelic languages. And it's potentially included Irish speakers, but I think in reality there'd be very few proficient Irish speakers in Nova Scotia who reported that they were able to speak that language. We've got a slight change in the question for the 2021 census, which changed to those who reported a knowledge of Gaelic, specifically Scottish Gaelic. This fell again, so halved, disappointingly for language advocates in Nova Scotia, to 635. This compares with actually the 100 Welsh speakers who were returned in Nova Scotia. So we're getting down to pretty small numbers, particularly when you compare with, I don't think a community of Welsh speakers, but just happens to be 100 people in Nova Scotia who claim to have knowledge of the Welsh language, not vastly different to the numbers now who report a knowledge of Gaelic. Contemporary revitalisation efforts in Nova Scotia stem from really the establishment of top-down institutional supports, which joined sort of earlier bottom-up efforts. So in 2004, the activist Fionn Finlay MacLeod was invited over from Scotland to introduce his ideas for language revival in Nova Scotia around his TIP model, Total Immersion Plus, and this developed into the Gaelic Icbale, Gaelic in the Home programme, which is still widely used in Nova Scotia. In 2009, the Bunaspar, which means root and branch, a master apprentice programme was started based on the work of Leanne Hinton with Californian Indigenous languages. In 2011, she was invited over to speak a bit more to that theme. So in total, there are around about 4,000 people in some form of instruction with Gaelic elements, whether it's just study around the history and culture of the language. In 2021, North America's first ever Gaelic immersion class opened in Mabu in Cape Breton Islands. So it'll be interesting to see. There were only 9 children who started in that class. It'll be interesting to see how numbers change in future and coming years. And May of every year has been designated Nova Scotia Gaelic Month. This was a poster which was designed a few years ago to publicise, as it says here, Gaelic Nova Scotia month. It's interesting to point out here, the Gaelic translation is Mias na Gael, which is literally month of the Gaels. It's not Nova Scotia Gaelic month or Gaelic Nova Scotia month. It is Mias na Gael, the month of the Gaels. So that's interesting. At the top it says na Gael, Frivichtje Asha, which means the Gaels rooted here. Again, back to this concept of rootedness in Nova Scotia. And it picks 6 generations of this, the Cameron family, going back all the way back to Ellen Macian who it'll be too small for you to see, but it says he was a pioneer settler in 1821, all the way down to Alistair and Mali at the bottom here. So depicting essentially 140 years of Gaelic language transmission across the generations in Nova Scotia. And a focus on L1, on native speakers here, rather than new speakers, even though the numbers now of L1 native speakers are very, very low indeed. But there is a Minister of Gaelic Affairs. This post was set up in 2006 when Rodney MacDonald, so obviously a chap with Gaelic family heritage, was the Premier of Nova Scotia, and he set up Office Ymchwil na Gaelic, the Office of Gaelic Affairs. Rodney MacDonald actually subsequently became the CEO of the Gaelic College in Cape Breton as well. So he had an interest in language, clearly, and it was an important development. It has quite a modest budget for programme funding. Currently has 3 permanent members of staff, although originally in 2006 there were 6. And this is the current Minister of Gaelic Affairs, the Honourable Alan McMaster. And in its own words, the office exists to support Nova Scotians in the reclamation of the Gaelic language and cultural identity, assisting in the building of communities through social and economic contributions. And it aims to do this by supporting adults and young people to further the language and cultural skills, develop their identity as Gaels. Now, this isn't something we see in Scotland very much at all, to even try and inculcate a sense of identity as Gaels. This isn't something that comes up in Gaelic medium education. To reinforce a sense of belonging and connection to the community, and to provide a sense of hope in staying, living and working in the province of Nova Scotia, so countering out-migration potentially, which continues to be a problem as with rural areas in large parts of the developed world. This was a poster designed to publicise Mias na Gael, Gaelic Nova Scotia month in 2021. It says, Erarst Lechele, forward together is the idea here. And each year takes on a different theme. There is this one scheme, I shouldn't say scheme, but policy which was introduced to help to publicise the Gaelic community in Nova Scotia and to raise money for Office Immersion in the Gaelic, was to launch these Gaelic licence plates that people could put on the back of their cars. They could buy them. That's officially recognised that you can have these licence plates on the back of your car driving around, and it helps the sort of local Gaelic speakers to identify one another. So again, the office helps Nova Scotians to reclaim their Gaelic language and identity as a basis for cultural, spiritual, community and economic renewal through opportunities to learn, share and experience Gaelic. So there's an idea here, you see the spiritual being emphasised, the community. It's not just a linguistic attempt to grow the numbers of speakers of the Gaelic language, but there's a sense of harking back to spiritual dimension, cultural dimension of what it means to be a Gael. This is to be achieved by creating awareness of Gaelic language, culture and history, and its contributions to Nova Scotia's diversity, community life and economy. And there's an emphasis on language training, particularly designing materials, funding innovative programming, strategic advice to enable appreciation, acquisition and use of Gaelic. Okay, so that's the sort of policy landscape in Nova Scotia. In 2016, so this is the sort of intermediary census return between the 2011 and 2021, returned to 910 speakers. I think this, as we saw, this is down to 635 in the 2021 return. But these small figures, these small numbers, are despite the fact that the Office of Gaelic Affairs in Nova Scotia claimed that 1/3 of Nova Scotians in total are descended from families who spoke Gaelic, so 315 1,000 or so individuals. So creating interest and awareness of Gaelic among this subsection of the population of Nova Scotia is going to be an important aim, I think, in future years. High school teaching of the language in what they call core Gaelic subjects has been important over the last few years. As I say, Gaelic immersion education was started a couple of years ago now. It'll be interesting to see how that develops in the next few years. But in terms of other individuals embracing opportunities for immersion, whether as part of lifelong learning or learning as adults, Seamus Watson and his colleague asked a few years ago now, who are these speakers, why are they learning Gaelic, how fluent are they, and how often do they use it? We haven't known much about this until relatively recently. So one particular focus of my research in Nova Scotia was to reflect on the motivations of cohorts of new speakers in the province and how these related to those of Scottish new speakers, and particularly the continued salience in Nova Scotia of notions of dúlachas, heritage and tradition in L1 native speaking communities in Scotland, and how it's related to what we saw in Nova Scotia. To turn briefly to what is being said about Gaelic identity among new speakers of the language in Scotland, I asked in an interview this one speaker who had originally come from Ireland and had acquired Gaelic, acquired Irish first, but then subsequently learned Gaelic. And I asked her, do you have an identity as a Gael? And she answered in English to sort of emphasise her rejection of this idea. She said, no, absolutely not. Stocha gyda rydechtriol hawn, van y Gael ananal, but really cut off deliberately. The Gaels in Scotland are really cut off deliberately. She said, and they were othered. And perhaps, a long pause here, that's it. Like in Ireland, I don't think the Gael Geordie, the Gaelic Irish speakers in Ireland are as othered as that. In Ireland, I never felt like, oh yeah, there's the Gaels and then there's us, but I maybe do feel like that in Scotland. So this is someone who's come into the Scottish Gaelic community from that background. So I asked another speaker, this is someone who had learned Gaelic as an adult in Scotland and subsequently raised his entire family as Gaelic speakers. He had 3 children, he and his wife spoke Gaelic to them all the time at home. So therefore I sort of said, well, presumably you'll have a sense of identity as Gaels. I asked him, I said, are you Gael are you Gaels as a family then, since you all speak Gaelic at home? He said, he said, I only use that word very occasionally. So in the context of the present day, I wouldn't really use that word. I would say loch na Gaelic, Gaelic people, more often. Fi'n le feicgelach chlechgug, she bachgug is over na Gaelic if you cantin hashinje falle marsluig. I would be very careful using that word, the Gaels. It's an obstacle to promoting the cause of Gaelic, to say we are a separate people. It goes on. Have ik gehoord in je Gael de roemse, maar Gael ko you, or Gaelsen ha barach me in Kasten Jack the Hogal. Agus Kujach gaan je lekker den you a stay. Marshant na, ga vi in a klechtig na Gael. So he says, for one, not everyone, not all Gaels would accept me as a Gael anyway, because for them it's more about where you're raised, the sort of environment you're brought up in, and also it doesn't allow new people into the community. So I wouldn't use the term na Gael, the Gaels. So this is the sort of these 2 extracts sort of encapsulate the experience in Scotland. It's not universally the case, but generally among new speakers in Scotland, there's this reticence to adopt any sort of identity as a Gael. It's seen as being problematic for most new speakers. I think avoiding any sort of association with ideas that could be viewed as essentialist or ethnocentric is something which most people in Scotland these days see as a characteristic best avoided. But I think there is also an awareness of trying to avoid cultural appropriation by adopting identity for themselves which native speakers wouldn't necessarily include them in. and the role of their own identity seems to play an important impact. We can compare the situation of new speakers of Gaelic in Scotland clearly to the experience of new Irish speakers, as addressed in Bernie Rock and John Walsh's new book. Now this compares to the situation in Nova Scotia. It says here, these are some badges which were used to publicise Nova Scotia Gaelic month a few years ago. Gael, say our name, this much more assertive identity as Gaels, which is being propounded and conveyed in Nova Scotia. So there's this one extended extract. How do you have the time? Okay, I'll just go through this in English just now. So this is this one speaker who I interviewed in Nova Scotia. She said, speaking about myself, I'd say now that I'm a Gael, that I'm a Gaelic woman, but I didn't know what a Gael was before I started learning Gaelic. And now when I look at my family, I know, although they don't speak Gaelic anymore, I can see just how Gaelic they are in their ways. And therefore I'd say lots of people in Nova Scotia are quite Gaelic, even though they can't speak Gaelic anymore. Their family spoke Gaelic, a generation or two ago, but they wouldn't recognise the name Gael. They'd maybe say, oh, we're Scottish, or we're Scotch. And someone else asked about the same sort of idea of what it means to be Gael, to have a Gaelic heritage. She said, "Dar hosh mi ar Gaelic, vad brin Swanyan, agus díalcha bing. Oh, she has got a Gael, Sarah Archie Angus, and challenge here about Darvamiog." She said, when I started learning Gaelic, they were talking about patronymics, and it was just like, bing. Oh, that's why they called that old lady Sarah Archie Angus when I was young, and other things like that. Oh my God, I think I'm Gaelic. At the end of the week, I said, oh my God, I think I'm Gaelic. Maar de big Caeredin the Gaelic at B, Burringo, come along on an Alban Newydd. Fimi Gaelic of na chri, and you're fimi to Caeredin, the hunaniaeth dinge, et doi a chorgan, a chanilmi brin DNA. If I didn't have, if there wasn't any connection to Gaelic, I couldn't have continued learning Gaelic in Nova Scotia. It has to be in your heart, or you have to make some sort of connection with a person's identity. But I'm not speaking about DNA. And what's interesting is that actually in some cases people are effectively speaking about DNA. They're speaking about family heritage, they're speaking about genealogies and ancestry. And so although no one's speaking about genomics as such, I think, and a lot of the time it is in Nova Scotia traced back to personal family history. And I think there's a sense in which this one speaker kind of reflected and critiqued that angle. She said, "Be mi gragri banagel hanum, ha gemak utermach sha, ha sin a fiachan bi clech gnachkel shit Gael, oh higher Africa than a legion." I do say I'm a Gael. It's quite important here. We do try to use that word Gael. Oh, but it's changed over the years. Well, Highlander, Scots, Scottish, Celtic, Jifferuden, different things. Hami Felican Gavel paused and sort of said, Ha sin siúl tro purism seo údanan, agus údanan chanir sin a costa glú. She said, I feel that there's quite a big sigh that we rely too much on purism here sometimes, and sometimes I don't enjoy that. And that was, I think, an allusion to the sense in which ancestry and family connection to the language are sort of emphasised and predicated to a very significant degree in Nova Scotia, not to the same degree that we see in nothing like what we see in Scotland at all. To turn briefly to this more recent fieldwork in the greater Boston area and speaking to people in different New England states, just to sort of summarise, American Gaelic learners' motivations and ideologies are kind of subtly different from their Nova Scotian counterparts generally. Heritage does seem to be a factor for some, but there is this great awareness of heterogeneity in identities and heritages in that part of America. And for some, it's important to point out that Gaelic was kind of this proxy language for other heritage languages. So there were individuals whose heritage language was Yiddish or Acadian French, and for whatever reason, Maybe because of, I don't know, intergenerational trauma, Gaelic was seen as something which would be less problematic and possibly easier for them to explore than their own direct family heritage languages. There are also these more generalised Scottish American identities coming through, and still sort of social cultural difference from the Gael identity, and I'll give some examples of that in a minute. They're all Outlander. Has anyone seen this show, Outlander? Like, none of the people I actually spoke to who had learned Gaelic and were speaking Gaelic referred to Outlander as in any way a motivational factor, but everyone else that I spoke to in Boston, when I said that we were over from Scotland, was, oh, have you seen Outlander? And particularly when I'm focused in, I said, well, I'm actually, trying to get hold of Gaelic speakers here. They said, oh, Outlander, it's better than Game of Thrones, it's the best thing ever. Not so popular in this country, and there are very good reasons for that, in my view. So I have to reflect on that a bit more carefully. This was one speaker I interviewed. He was from California originally, but he had been in Nova Scotia in New England for a few years. I asked him, Dunmore, why did you become interested in Gaelic in the first place? And he laughed. He said, she's skill more a ham. Harshik me a Gaelic and heathen that about me as an alhai, because harshik me can you fair Gaelach hanum, eager, she fair yuach hanum. So he said, I've got this on the following slide in English. He said, it's a long story. I started on Irish Gaelic when I was in university, and he says, I'm not any kind of Gael or Highlander at all. I'm a Jewish man. So I said, so you're not a Gael? I said, no, absolutely rejected that. I said, definitely not. I have no family connection to Scotland. But I remember when I was in Scotland, I had much better Gaelic at the time, so I remember people saying that I was a Gael. I didn't think that at all. Two other people who I interviewed in English, their Gaelic wasn't perhaps developed enough yet for them to feel comfortable speaking to me in Gaelic. It's one person I spoke to outside of Boston. He said, I think Gaels are a very specific group that you might not be able to integrate with in the same way. America is such a hodgepodge. I think sometimes we've got to dig back into our past, trying to find those connections with the original family, and I think as far as integration or being a Gael, it isn't here. It's what the actual Gaels in Scotland think about that. So in a way, it's like none of my business as an American Gaelic speaker whether I'm a Gael or not. It's whether the authentic L1, and I say authentic under caution here, what L1 or native Gaels would say about their potential identities that would be important. This other speaker said, I feel a bit of a connection to the long-term American story, which is fraught with all kinds of mischief. I'm very much for, as a writer, they say, kill your darlings. I don't know if you've heard this expression. I hadn't. Right, full disclosure, I hadn't heard this expression. I don't know if you've heard this expression. Take that whole paragraph that you think is so precious and just kill it. I think it's kill your heroes. The other thing where don't idolize your ancestors one way or the other. I mean, that's complicated. They're just people. So that's not something we see coming through in the Nova Scotia data at all. It's not a question of idolizing one's ancestors, but the focus on ancestry in that context is very important. The American new speakers that I spoke to here were saying you can't idolize, you can't focus just on your ancestry because the people you're descended from are probably not that great. How are we for time? So in terms of Scotland, Nova Scotia, there are these very different kinds of visions of Gaelic language identity which are coming through, appealing to different audiences, as my colleague Michael Newson said a few years ago. Now, if you think about the sort of categories of identity that are available to Gaelic speakers in these two contexts, they're very different. And then the New England context brings in different potential identities altogether. Some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years with colleagues at the University of Sussex is focused on the experience of children of colour who've gone through Gaelic medium education in Scotland. And this is, I think, really why, or at least it becomes clearer, why issues of ethnicity and ethnic identity around Gaelic come to the fore and why they are so important. I've been looking at, in a bit more detail, the effects of systemic racism as it exists in Scotland. It's not specific to Gaelic medium education at all. on the development of identity and, obviously, language skills among children of colour in that situation. I spoke to a couple of parents who've got kids in the system at the moment who come from a mixed ethnic background. One mother explained to me about Gaelic medium in the city. She said it's not multicultural, and that wasn't ideal for me, but it's no different. It's still more multicultural than the school I went to in England. I see it as a responsibility to challenge racist attitudes that you're just born with when you're born brown. I haven't got much I can pass on to them in terms of my African culture, but we're all enjoying learning about the Gaels together, and bits that we really like. It's become a more adopted culture. We've explored it all together. So really quite a positive reflection on the experience of Gaelic medium education. That was the case for certain parents and certain young adults who'd gone through Gaelic medium education, but it wasn't the case for all. So this other mother I spoke to, both her children had gone through Gaelic medium education. Her younger child she'd actually taken out of the system because the experience had been so bad. Speaking about her older child, she said the first time she experienced it was, I think, was in P1, so first year of primary school. I think there was something in Scolari, so the preschool as well. The problem is the teachers, they never tell you what's going on. This actually happened in P1. A P4 boy, so a boy, a much older boy, 3 years her senior, told her, "What kind of brown rat would give birth to a dog like you?" But the head's constant response was, "There's no bullying, there's no racism." And I told her plenty of times, I said, "Look, that's gaslighting." And she carried on. I asked her a bit later about her daughter, who she said that her daughter actually described Gaelic as her mother tongue these days, and in spite of the negative experiences she'd had, she viewed herself as having this sort of identity. I said, you mentioned before that she says that Gaelic's her first language. Do you think she sort of has the identity that goes along with Gaelic? Would she sort of see herself as belonging to that community? This mother said, she paused for almost a second, she said, I think she does, but others don't. And that's the cognitive dissonance that's created in Gaelic children of colour. Because the first thing is when people talk about families of colour speaking Gaelic, the first line of differentiation is as Gaelic speakers of colour as opposed to Gaels of colour. And that's the terminology, because it's like, oh, you're only a speaker of Gaelic, you cannot be a Gael of colour. And she sees herself as a Gael of colour. But that's not how all like white Scottish people or even white Irish people see her, and other black kids. And so that for me, like I often hear the differences in terminology, and so I'm immediately like filing it away, saying, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's because you don't see us as belonging. So that's just a brief couple of excerpts from the research that I was conducting on obstacles to the development of a sort of bilingual and bicultural identity in Gaelic medium education among kids of colour in Scotland. And we could speak about that a bit later, potentially. In terms of identities and this sort of melange, this diverse mix of contexts, in Scotland we can see that the language clearly plays an important role in the day-to-day lives of new speakers, but perhaps isn't impacting on identities in the same way. Not the case in Nova Scotia. Boston, New England is different again in Gaelic medium education, and particularly in terms of the experiences of children of colour going through that system. The experience is subtly different again, and sometimes quite negative. So I'm continuing to write up my book on the Nova Scotian and Scottish data. That will be completed soon, touch wood, and exploring some of the data from Boston and from the Sussex research in a bit more detail, with a view hopefully to understand a bit better how cultural identity and ethnicity seem to figure into promoting greater usage and identification with the Gaelic language and community in these different contexts, with a view ultimately to putting into language policy formulation. So we'll leave it there for now. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Warren Paddington, eisiau crwm. Thanks everyone.
Stranger with other minority languages, I really want